So I really enjoyed this paper. Thank you. It was a pleasure. And so reading on this wonderful reflection on media, place, and diplomacy, and in the context of your other work, first I thought of Dr. Strangelove. Then I thought of drone warfare in Pakistan. Then I thought of the ads for the Air Force, which struck me, their airspace and cyberspace. And then finally, I thought of WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks, in the light of this conversation, to my mind, is not an aberration in politics, but symptomatic of this new diplomatic order that Dederian describes, in how it marked the impact of new media, high-velocity communication, as well as new spaces and new actors in diplomacy and geopolitics, with its made-for-TV news coverage, like just made-for-news coverage leader, Assange, the diffuse locations of WikiLeaks activists and data servers, the interaction between state actors disrupted by the release of backstage information about diplomacy by this rude guy from Australia, the sheer quantity of information flooding into the mediascape, and the emergence of new diplomatic actors, pointing to this shift in our understanding of the diplomatic order. Hence my enjoyment of this paper, which provided really a compelling illustration for me in the ways in which media leap-bound and over and under new configurations of space, power, and political interests. So I want to unpack this notion of content diplomacy a little bit as a way into these questions of space, scale, locality, territory, politics, etc., and of course media, concluding, if I may, with a couple of examples of what I started thinking of as quantum moments after this paper. So the term quantum, of course, sets up necessarily this notion of both entanglement and unpredictability or uncertainty, where things both are and are not, and also, or maybe are something else. And the paper, of course, takes us through this visual and mediated journey of conjunctural events that shifted meaning on the ground. And the gaze of the alienated drifter, the alienated man, the flaneur, made me also think of the gaze of media as observer. And so ultimately the argument, as I see it, is that old ways of thinking no longer apply, that classical laws of diplomacy cannot capture or explain quantum events, that we need to look at new places, new scales, and new logics. So in terms of media scholarship, I situated this for myself next to Harvey and Giddens' notion of time-space compression, and I know that your work draws on Paul Virilio and the notion of velocity and virtuality, and perhaps chronopolitics as well. There are other scholars who talk about the delinking of space and culture, or space and politics, the transforming of boundaries and events, and the notion of flows and de- and re-territorialization, which, as I remind myself, refers not only to a sense of cultural or psychogeography, but also the movements of capital, power, interest, and empire. And to those rupturing of rules and boundaries here, I sort of add, so we think of the rupturing of rules, boundaries, shifting of scales and stages, on which diplomacy is done both above and below the scale of the state, and hence the assembly of these elements into new configurations and uncertain outcomes. In this case, the quantum moments that Dederian describes are implicated in moments of reconfiguration, not mere serendipity, but entanglement and leaping. So his own encounters of space, first the op-ed, then about the place of Eisenhower in Berlin, picked up by the newspaper lead in Der Spiegel, then Deutsche Welle, and then, of course, Mitchell-Moss. These notions of remediation led to an uncertain meaning in the final cut, and a sort of slippage. And also, one of the thoughts that came to me was, okay, if we're thinking of new actors, then are you also an actor in diplomacy? Are you, in fact, I don't know if I can say diplomat? What are the new actors? Well, there you go. So yeah, maybe they're new actors, new diplomatic figures, new diplomats. So also in the struggle of the mythologizing of Reagan and his placement in Berlin, I put this next to examinations of war and photography, Zelizer and Sturken, the urgency of memory work. And I did wonder, why these attempts to Reaganize Berlin now? What are the contemporary currents of conservative recuperation, perhaps, that are making this happen now? Because this was earlier this year. And obviously I wondered how these attempts try to stabilize meaning and erase harms and, like I said, recuperate conservative politics. So his description of, and I'm quoting from the paper here, private foundations, those charities, private foundations seeking to reshape public spaces through the negotiation with local municipalities, unquote, using capital, influence, and the transgression of both what a charitable foundation is, but also the scale of political action, for me, really hit home to this notion of dislocation and translocation of interests, which the interest in this money and these actors take off somewhere, alight somewhere else, and then are refused at the local level. So in this narrative, money, power, interest were re-territorialized, re-engaged in new spaces of struggle. But despite the power of the state actors and the money, the outcome was not given. So I would actually, one of the questions I have is, I would like to hear more about this notion of re-territorialization as you conceptualize it, because I'm coming from a media cultural geography standpoint. So I'd love to hear more about that. So I read this notion of de- and re-territorialization not as diffuse non-existence, but as ever becoming, not diffuse as in placeless, but roving, moving and roving, not no place, but replace and new place, okay? So media transformations of space and of meaning are sort of perhaps even a phenomenological change in the experiences, not as substitution, but as reconfiguration. But now to the last point of media as observation. Elsewhere, Dedarian has spoken compellingly of the military-industrial media entertainment network, of which you saw mention in the clip, and of the shift from war as spectacle to this permanent spectacle of war, of the fetishization of technology, or the fundamentalism of technology, as Virilio phrases it. But he also talks about happy accidents or new events. So I wonder, in this narrative, the role of the gaze and the role of this exercise of psychogeographic drift made me also think of, the camera lens, media observation, and the erasure of space-time. And through these global flows, new juxtapositions, new configurations of meaning, new political possibilities and alliances, and new uncertainties. So speed and observation do change the event. No longer does the news report in this shift from classical politics to classical diplomacy that a bunch of men are signing treaties behind closed doors in a country estate in England somewhere. No longer is the press conference relating events that have happened behind those doors. Instead, media are, as you point out, observing, reflecting in both senses of the word, and transforming events. And as I said earlier, bypassing conventional regional geopolitical boundaries. Actually made me think back to the Tiananmen Square as a moment where the media did observe, though perhaps they did not protect. But the observation of the event was a first political moment where we were watching that was mediated. Well, there are a number of those, but I think of that moment as interesting in terms of its recognition of violence elsewhere. And also, I looked it up, and Rolling Stone in 1989 actually used the phrase Beijing Spring, which was not, I think, widely circulated in that coverage, but it really spoke to me now, of course. And today, of course, in the context of new social media, new media, the multiplicity of media representation, the wide circulation of protest images and video, even the reappropriation of historical and cinematic imagery, as I'll show in a moment, may well bring this new set of technical logics, a new sense of engagement and alliance, but at the very least, a new sense of urgency and the space to re-articulate the meaning of those events, fundamental uncertainty of meaning, and a need to re-theorize politics, policy, and diplomacy. So in addition to WikiLeaks, I want to cite in closing two more examples of the ways in which media flows, and this is where I need to find my PowerPoint, excuse me. Yeah, it's opening, I believe. Where did I go? Oh yes, media flows and media observation change the nature of events, bringing them into these new configurations, forcing reversals of perspective. Can I get this open? Ah, there we go. Reversals of perspective and allowing new alliances, not just explaining what events are or what is important, but who people are and how we relate to them, and in illustrating perhaps the failure of state-based diplomacy. As an explanation, So first of all, is there a keyboard, or do I advance it? How do I advance the slide? Oh, thank you. So at the start of the year, we saw the Arab Spring, which arguably was not produced by social media alone. There were political forces behind it, but they used social media as a means of expression, of publication, of opinion, and protest. At the same time, in Wisconsin, which is where I lived before I came here, workers rallied to protest Governor Walker's attacks on workers' rights. These were hyper-mediated events. News coverage, of course, which may or may not have been late to the game, but they were mediated through news coverage, but also through social media. So I was just really moved by this expression of a connection between, and a reversal, right, of direction, of message between Egypt. Egypt supports Wisconsin workers, one world. I can't make out the last phrase, one pain. And then, so, this, of course, how did I find it? I saw it through Facebook. And, that's how I experienced some of these events. And then then I Googled myself. I started Googling as well as a research thing, and I found this. To the Occupy movement, the occupiers of Tahrir Square are with you. And this is dated just a few days ago. And this is a message from Tahrir Square to Occupy Wall Street. And then finally, I want to show you a last image where the reappropriation, the Guy Fawkes, which picked up in the movie V for Vendetta, the Guy Fawkes imagery is picked up in the Occupy movement from local, it says from local action to a global howl of protest. And this blew me away because this is a geotagged map of various city spaces where local Occupy Wall Street protests are tagging themselves and showing a global alliance. And I love this in terms of your work because of the sense of city, I was really curious about city spaces and how you talk about retailizing in city spaces, but how this global map shows up at the face of V for Vendetta too, the film. So I just want to close with the question of, well, who does diplomacy now? How is it paced and where is it done? How does this quantum rather than the classical frame force a change in our conceptualization of diplomacy and our understanding of diplomatic actors? And how do we understand the intersection of old and new frameworks, institutions, and configurations? After all, in the case of WikiLeaks, Bradley Manning, the guy who leaked the documents, he did go to jail. Thank you.